bell rang. Well, good morning, everyone. Wow, looks like I'm pretty loud today. It's great to see you all here again as we continue our study of the life of Paul and his insight towards salvation by his way of writing a letter to the church at Ephesus. If you'll remember that we've actually been looking at the obligations of the church in response to God's offer of spiritual blessings to all who come to Jesus by way of their baptism. So a quick question right off the bat, because we're going to be talking a lot about it today. How easy is it for people to think of the church as simply a building? I see some nods. You think that's pretty easy to do? Are we all kind of guilty of that? I know I am. When I think of, say, the church at 5th and Greenwich, I think of what? The building there. But the church is what? The people. Okay. Now, the blessings we just mentioned include the pursuit of unity and personal righteousness in our lifestyles. Okay? So now we're in the process of studying the various features of the righteous lifestyle that's described for us in chapters 4, verse 17, all the way down through chapter 6, 19 of Ephesians. And so far, in our classes before, we've seen Paul describe 3 of these features of a righteous lifestyle. Number 1 is having a loving attitude. Okay. Number 2, we've discussed a life beyond reproach. And then we've talked about piety, which is best seen in the virtue of prudence and the practice of spirit-filled living and submissiveness among the brothers and sisters in the church. Okay? Okay, who remembers the definition of piety? Anybody remember that? Think about this real heavy. Piety is the quality of being religious, reverent, or devout. Okay? Now, how about prudence? If we live in piety with prudence, we need to know those two. Prudence is the ability to govern and discipline ourselves by use of reason. So if we are educated enough by means of the Word, okay, that we can reason things, this will help us be more pious, okay, and make us better people. At this point then, now that we've reviewed everything, we're going to look at a 4th element of righteousness described by Paul, which is simply an ordered life. That's what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the 3 previous features had to do with a person's individual character and attitude. The last feature defines the Scripture's relationship with 2 things: family and society. When it comes to these, God's established a desired order according to His will. So first today, let's consider the orderly family. Okay? We start out with Ephesians 5, verses 22 and 23. And this tells us, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is head of the wife, as Christ also is head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. Okay? So Paul begins with a description of the orderly family because it's really the basic unity, or the basic unit, I should say, in society. And this is the way it's been for most of recorded history. If there's disorder in the family, there can easily be a disorder in society. Okay? Do you think that this might be a growing problem in our country today? Yes or no? Do you think that could be a problem? Okay. I think it's yes too. And I was thinking real heavy about it, and I think it may be because we tend to consider any relationship orderly and a family when actually it isn't, right? Now, Paul doesn't cover every detail of a woman's role in marriage, but instead, he establishes the one basic attitude that will guide all others when he says wives should submit to their husbands. And remember that we learned last week the word submit used here is what kind of term? Military. Okay? And that means to rank under or to yield. Just like those of us in the military, when the admiral came, we knew that we had to treat him a certain way because he had the word. Okay? Wives are supposed to do this, by the way, voluntarily, because it's not a question of superiority, but rather a question of faith. Okay? If you know by the word that you're supposed to be or do something, and you have the faith for it, you can, in fact, do it. In other words, we simply need to obey God, don't we? It's the bottom line. Paul says, in the same way you submit to Christ, submit also to your husband, when he's talking about the wives. Remember, that's husband, not your boy or girlfriend. Okay? And we were talking about just a while ago that that's kind of the way it is. Is it unusual now for you to come across a man and woman who just live together, have kids, but they never got married? Is that unusual nowadays? Not at all. Happens all the time. Is this more or less promoted as okay in all of the entertainment that we get to watch? Do we watch movies and everything where they're boyfriend and girlfriend, they live together and they have a couple of kids, nobody cares? Sure. We're slowly being taught that that's okay. But is it really? No. It says specifically, wives should submit to their husband. That's now if you can. When I told Ann that, in that case, from now on you're peeling all the potatoes, that didn't work. So, but remember, one can't be done without the other. Now, Paul answers the question, why is this necessary? The answer is God's given the leadership role in the family to the husband, just as he's made Christ the head of the church. And remember, there can only be one head, just as there can only be one body. So God's created marriage in such a way that it's an instructional copy of the relationship between Christ and the church. Now, that a wife willingly submits to her husband is a spiritual idea, and sometimes that's hard to grasp with a carnal mind. Okay, certainly it's not. We just discussed it's not part of the world in general. But the point Paul wants to make is that when this takes place, It creates harmony between what's seen and what's not seen, not only in our world as we live it, but in our spiritual world. Okay? It all works together. Now, naturally, and of course, it isn't always possible if the husband dies, or if he's an unbeliever, abusive, or if he refuses leadership. And along with this, the wife may be evil, refuse to accept her role, and so forth. So just as other things Paul's mentioned to the church, a loving attitude, piety, and so forth, submissiveness is a goal Christian wives should strive for through practice in prayer, and it should be a goal for all Christians now. Now, some say, that, this was just a social thing in the first century and it's not valid anymore. But Paul confirms that the church has and will maintain its relationship with Christ. How long? Forever, okay? In the same way, then, there's a marriage relationship between the saved and the church until we're in heaven. And this is the way God intends for it to be. Marriage will always reflect the church. So there's really no confusion. The wife should be prepared to yield completely to her husband. So, maybe young women should consider before marrying the question, is this the kind of man I can be willing to submit to? This should be something to think about before saying I do. Not just where they're going to live and work and what kind of wedding dress to buy and so forth and so on. Okay, then the question is, a girl should ask herself, am I really willing to put my life into this guy's hand? If not willing to do this, maybe she ought to just pass on it. What about today? How are we doing in our nation as far as the ratio of marriages to divorces? Anybody know how that's working for us today in the United States? I looked it up. And it's sad. 40 to 50% of first marriages end up in divorce. Horrible. And it gets worse. 60 to 67% of second marriages end up there too. Guess who makes a whole lot of money nowadays? Divorce lawyers. Every one of them swamped. What a shame. But Paul had the knowledge of the major cause of marital conflict and divorce, that simply being confusion of the roles within the marriage. And that certainly still applies. Some have the attitude that says, I'll submit only when and where I feel like it because I want my independence. The mistake in thinking like this is the fact that there is no independence in marriage. Marriage is actually the opposite of independence. Instead, it's a mutually dependent state where each partner strives to serve the other in love. Some reject the notion of submissiveness because they're afraid of abuse. And this is okay. This is with good cause. Because abuse comes from sinful men who don't understand their role in Christian marriage. And this is why it's good to consider marrying a faithful Christian. Okay. What about husbands? Again, Paul mentions only one thing about them, but it describes the attitude towards their wives that will set the tone for the entire relationship. Quite simply, it's just love your wives. Love has lots of expressions and words that describe it. In the Greek language, which was the original language of the New Testament, various Greek words can be translated into the English word love. For example, the Greek word eros generally refers to love in a sensual way, but the love of art and music are described by this word as well. Then the Greek word philios, on the other hand, describes the non-sensual love that two friends might share, or even the emotion that drives people to give philanthropically. Another Greek word, storogos, describes love that can exist or should exist between family members. But the word Paul uses to describe the love that a man must have for his wife is the Greek word agapao, which is the type of love that's sacrificial in nature. Love that can be sacrificial. In the next verses, he gives Jesus as the example of this kind of sacrificial love. And remember, Jesus' love for his bride, which is the church, included, number one, his willingness to die for her. Did he? Lots of nods. Number two, his teachings to guarantee her life. And then number three, his care to completely purify her and give her an irrevocable position next to him in heaven. Every husband has a degree of love and a sense of belonging in a family. But for this attitude to be raised to a spiritual level, there needs to exist a readiness to love his wife in a sacrificial way, no matter what. This is what Christ demands of husbands in a marriage. Why in the world is this? Because in the marriage, and we've heard this, the two actually become one. And when a man loves his wife, he's actually loving himself. So once again, it's all based on love. What's a good example of this? Jesus Christ himself, right? Perfect example. As the head of the church, Jesus loves and cares for the body in all patience, tenderness, and necessary sacrifice. And that's why the church happily submits itself to Jesus and the Word. And what is the Word? Who said, I am the Word? Jesus said, I am the Word. Okay? So, there's a whole bunch of things that Ephesians teaches young men to look for and consider before they marry a girl or a lady. First, is this girl ready to submit to him in marriage? Okay. Then, is he prepared to provide the correct leadership? Is he, number three, able to sacrifice himself for her? And to, number four, provide for her and their family? And then place her needs before his own? And then treat her as a special gift from God? And finally, give her continually honor and respect. Okay? So all this, does he want to be this way, or does he just want to have her because she can satisfy his needs and serve him, take care of his house, or be a replacement for his mother? Quite simply, men should know how to be head of their wives as Christ is head of the church. Seeing and knowing this means that women can happily submit themselves to their husband's leadership. Okay? Now, when we do all of this, we get great marriages And great marriages, widespread, can mean great churches. And great churches, widespread, can mean great countries, and so forth and so on. So it's all extremely important. Although when we first look at this, what Paul's saying to the men and women about marriage, sometimes it may seem a little, what? Negative. But all in all, this is how it should work. So a while ago, we talked about how this may be slowly going away. We need to be careful to make sure that we as individuals never let this happen. So we can see Paul summarized God's plan for orderliness in marriage. It requires that the marriage be contracted as one man and one woman, faithfully married to one another for life. This model for marriage is heavenly in nature because it reflects the union that Christ has with his church. And in such a relationship, basic attitudes are simply the wife submits to her husband in all things, and then the husband loves his wife with a sacrificial love, much or more than he loves himself. Okay? Nowadays, we can even, in some places, marry those of the same sex. That is really, really horrible, but kind of the way it goes. We have to always, though, be careful that we always have the example that people see of us as members of the church. Last couple of weeks ago, we talked about how that as church members, we need to be very careful because people will look at us and go, yeah, I told you so, But we got to really be careful that we do the right things, because we can be a good or a bad example to the rest of the world as we're going out and trying to convince them to be saved. Okay, moving on now. Paul speaks to wives and husbands, and now he addresses the third part of the family unit, the children. Order in a family requires that mothers and fathers maintain certain attitudes and rules, and that children obey them. Again, Paul doesn't give every little detail about the children's role and obligations, just the basic one found way back in the Old Testament. This is a variation of the commandment in Exodus 20:12, which tells us children are to obey their parents because of the Lord and according to the Lord. Children need to obey their parents. Okay? The obedience to parents is limited to those things that the Lord would require. In Exodus, the promise is that those who do obey would have a long life in the promised land. Paul revises this promise a little bit so that it'll include not only the people that God is talking about, but Gentiles as well. Paul adds an exhortation to fathers in the way that they should bring up their kids. The command for children to obey is tempered with an appeal to fathers not to use their authority in such a way as to provoke their children to become angry or discouraged. Children have feelings, and to provoke them to helpless anger is wrong. Instead, Paul says that fathers should raise their children according to the discipline and teachings of who? Jesus. Remember, in those days, fathers had the power of life and death over the young ones. How many rights did the children have? 0. They didn't have any rights at all. So Paul urges fathers to actually direct the upbringing of their children according to the practice and teaching of Jesus, and not according to whatever social customs of the time come up, or whatever personal whims or situations come up. And that same holds true for us today. Paul concludes his instructions for an orderly family by stating that the duty of children is to obey their parents, and that a father is to lead in raising of the children. Okay. So how about today? In our modern world, we mostly have mothers holding full-time jobs along with the husbands, right? And the children end up being turned over to daycare? Can this reality cause problems for the children? How about schools today? Are they the same as when we were in school? What should parents do in this regard? Remember, back when I was young, for some reason, my mother stayed home and kept the kids. When I grew up and left, she got a job. Now, what did that mean for our family when I was a kid? Dirt poor. Beans and cornbread. Was that okay? Better than some, right? So it's hard to make a decision when you have children, because we all live in the United States where it's pretty nice to have all kinds of good stuff, isn't it? And it's kind of bad to be poor. And I'm not saying right now that you should quit your job just because you have a couple of kids in daycare. I'm really not saying that. I'm just saying that if that's your situation, you have to be extremely careful the way that you raise these children and have to be insightful about who they are and where they're learning what they learn. Okay. Let's move on now and consider an orderly society in Ephesians 6. As we've mentioned before, the fourth requirement of righteousness is ordered living. And Paul breaks this down into two main components: ordered families and then an ordered society. A righteous man or woman will strive to pattern his or her family according to the order that Christ provides in his word. And the same person will also work hard to pattern his position in society according to the will of Christ. In the next verses, Paul explains the responsibility of the two main positions in society of that era. They had two main things: masters and slaves. He'll show that regardless of one's position in society, a righteous person conducts himself in the order Christ has given. Now, first, he considers slaves in Ephesians 6, 5 through 8, where he tells us, "Slaves, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your heart, as to Christ, not by way of eye service as men pleasers, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. With good will render service, as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good thing each one does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether slave or free." Okay. Who knows what a slave is? I mean, we think of slaves back then. Who knows what slaves really are? I just happen to have a definition. Slavery is a system which principles of property law are applied to people, enabling individuals to own, buy, and sell other individuals, designated slaves, as a form of property. Slaves are unable to withdraw from this arrangement and are typically forced to work for very little or no pay. Slavery has played a role in the history of nearly every country on earth and remains a massive problem in many places around the globe. Okay? Now remember, Paul here doesn't really give all the details concerning the life and work of a slave. And back then, there were actually several classes, and each had their own degree of responsibility. The key ingredient Paul urged them to cultivate was severe obedience. This required them to obey with the knowledge that their masters were masters not only of their bodies, and not their souls. Thus, they obey according to the flesh. He instructs them to obey with respect and enthusiasm. They were not to act as hypocrites towards their masters by feigning submissiveness while despising them in their hearts. Paul says that they should obey with sincere goodwill, knowing that serving in this way fulfills the will of God in this matter. God is going to end up, he says, rewarding both slave and master in the end. Now, he doesn't promote or defend slavery here by saying all this. Don't get it wrong. In 1 Corinthians 7:21, he tells the church there, were you called as a slave? Do not let that concern you. But if you are able to become free, take advantage of that. So he's not condoning it. He's just telling those that are in a position like that how to be. He gives those in that position the way to live so as to please the Lord, and in doing so demonstrate their righteousness even as slaves. In the end, though, history demonstrates that the rise and practice of Christianity, not necessarily open rebellion, has done away with slavery in a lot of places, a lot of countries. But maybe not, and maybe forever not, completely. Because, here's a question. What about today? Do we still have slavery in our world? You think we have slavery still? Shouldn't have, should we? But I see some nods. We do. Despite global efforts, it's actually widespread, with 167 countries harboring an estimated 46 million slaves, including forced labor and even sexual exploitation. Now, modern slavery's definitions have evolved, encompassing not only ownership, but also includes forced marriages, government-imposed labor, and human trafficking. While Asian countries have the highest total number of slaves, African and Middle Eastern countries, smaller in population, show a higher incidence of slavery per capita. So it's still everywhere. What about the United States?
Absolutely.
You mean the land of the free has slaves?
See it on the news every day.
See it on the news every day, absolutely.
People that are beholden to cartels that come into this country.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they don't call them slaves, but it just depends on their definition.
But it's really a form of slavery.
To do whatever
Absolutely.
their masters want them to do.
Exactly. When you consider bringing on undocumented people to work in factories or plants for less than minimum wage in cash, there's a horrible, horrible thing going on. And I've personally seen it. Where I used to do the air conditioning for a great big meat company in Texas, they hired undocumented workers that had sneaked across the border. They paid them almost nothing in cash. And there they were, beholden to their masters. And meanwhile, the owner of the company was filthy rich, unbelievably rich. So that's actually a form of slavery. And then there's the horrible bringing in of underage girls for you know what. So it happens. That happens a lot in border states. Now, slavery means also that there are masters. And he addresses this in Ephesians 6:9. And masters do the same things to them and give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven. There is no partiality with him, capitalized. So he finishes up here with a word to them. Remember, there were even Christians who owned slaves in those days. An example is Philemon. That was just simply the structure of the society. Back then, a household included family and slaves as basically one unit. To the masters, Paul gives one reminder, which is that everyone, whether called slave or master, has the same master in heaven who's going to end up judging all. Okay? Do y'all all believe that? See some nods. Okay? And this judge, and this will be a judge who won't be favorable to one or the other based on their position. All will be judged according to the same standard and righteousness spoken in God's Word. If this is so, then, Paul says they should stop using threats and violence to motivate their slaves. Again, an attitude of fairness and respect should carry over to today's employees or today's people who hire people to work for them. The unsaid idea Paul's telling us is that today's masters should use what the master of all uses for motivation. We should always remember to be kind. We should always remember to be teachers. We should always remember to have encouragement. And above all, we should be generous. There's no reason not to be generous in our world today. Okay, with all of this, Paul completes the information concerning the final elements required in order to live a righteous life before God. And then an ordered life in one's family and society. So, we need to live a righteous life. Okay? And what's a good way to do that? What's a good way to live a righteous life? What do we need in order for us to do that correctly? How about knowing what righteous is? Think that's important? Where do we learn where righteous is? Where? The Word. Okay. What's another good thing we can do as far as maintaining our righteousness?
Treat others the way you would like to be treated.
Boom, you hit it. Treat others, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay. Anybody else got any other ways that we can help us be and stay righteous?
We have to teach our children that same lesson.
We have to teach our children. Absolutely. That way we can have an ordered family within our family, and then an ordered family within our church. Another thing we can do that can really help us maintain our righteousness is hang around with righteous people. What's a good way to do that? Try. Be where the church is. You see, a lot of good things happen when we're all out in the foyer talking, don't you? Nothing wrong with that, because we're talking to the right people in that case. Okay? So we need to maintain an ordered life in one's family and society as well. And we just talked about the best things that we can do to maintain our ordered life, didn't we?
I think it's important, too, for us as Christians to look back at Paul's letter to Philemon. We are all brothers and sisters in Christ.
That's right.
No one is greater and
That's
no
right.
one is smaller. Others have different talents, things like that, which we admire. But to God, we're all equal in His sight.
Every one of us is exactly equal, no matter what we look like, no matter if we're way too short. Wait a minute. But you're right. We all should do that. Another thing that we can do to really help us is to volunteer, to do things for the church. Sometimes this is hard to do. It's real easy to say, you know what, I don't really want to do that. But if you're doing it, if you're doing something for the church, and if you pray to God, please show me what to do for the church, you can really help build up the church, can't you? It's just one of the things you can do. Now, Paul is going to complete this section by examining one more obligation that the church has in response to God's blessings. Remember, we were talking about that we get all these blessings, but there are some obligations for us to get it correctly. So one of the other things he's going to be talking about is faithfulness. And we're going to take a look at that next time, as we can see in the rest of chapter 6. So if you haven't read chapter 6 totally, I'd recommend that you go ahead and read it through. And while you're reading it, think of some of the things that we've discussed today, and then apply that to your own individual life and see how you're doing, okay? Okay, anybody got any more questions or comments to make before we shut her down this morning? Anything? Well, I really appreciate your attention and your comments, and we will see you next time.